Every one of these stories had a dumb moment. Someone ran a generator inside a closed garage. Someone else walked right up to a firework that didn't go off. I'm Patrick. This is Last Records. Today, I'm looking at the razor-thin line between a bad idea and a final mistake. And the dumbest part isn't how these people died, it's how easily they could have lived. Isn't how these people died, it's how easily they could have lived. It was February 8th, 2014. A nor'easter moved through northern New Jersey, cutting power to hundreds of thousands by mid-afternoon. On a quiet street in Maplewood, one home went dark. A portable generator sat unused in the attached garage, where it had been stored since October. Dale Persett, 41, worked as a logistics coordinator, organized at work, careless at home. He had bought a 5,500-watt generator after seeing a neighbor keep their lights on during an outage, but never tested it. His wife Renata, 39, a dental hygienist, had read the manual and taped a carbon monoxide warning to the fuel tank. Dale removed it, calling it unnecessary. He had also taken out the carbon monoxide detector because it beeped and he couldn't reset it. He wasn't known as reckless. He simply trusted his own judgment over instructions. Renata left that afternoon for her mother's house, telling Dale not to run the generator in the garage. He said he understood. That evening, her brother Marcus Tilley, 38, arrived with his 17-year-old son Cody after losing power at their apartment. As temperatures dropped, Dale pulled the generator into the garage, kept the door closed, and ran extension cords through a slightly open door to power a television and space heater. When he turned it on, Marcus pointed out the exhaust and said it felt strong for something running inside a garage. Dale brushed it off and said that was just how generators were. Marcus paused for a moment, looked toward the garage door, then didn't say anything else and left it there. The three settled into the living room. The television was on. Cody sat on the floor playing his game. When Renata called later, Dale told her everything was fine. She asked if the generator was outside. He answered vaguely. She did not press further. Carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless. From what I've read in multiple reports, this is exactly why incidents like this escalate without warning at all. It accumulated first in the garage, reaching dangerous concentrations, then began seeping into the shared living space through the open interior door, small structural gaps, and natural air movement between connected spaces. Cody, due to his smaller body size and higher breathing rate, would have absorbed carbon monoxide more quickly than the adults. The adults followed within the same period. As concentrations rose, coordination and awareness would have declined. Marcus was later found near the hallway, suggesting he may have tried to move. Dale remained on the couch. The generator, with a full tank, continued running through the night. The next morning, a neighbor went to check after repeated unanswered calls. He found Dale slumped on the couch, the television still on. Marcus lay face down near the hallway. Cody was curled on his side on the floor, his game still in his hand, its battery long dead. The neighbor stopped at the doorway and called emergency services. The generator could still be heard running until responders shut it off. Renata, already on her way back after failing to reach them, arrived to find emergency vehicles outside. She was stopped before reaching the house. She sat down on the frozen lawn. I honestly don't think there's a way to fully process a moment like that in real time. Autopsies determined all three died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Dale's blood showed a carboxyhemoglobin level far beyond survivable limits. His heart showed no prior disease. Marcus's results were similar. A minor facial injury was noted from his fall, but deemed irrelevant. Cody had the highest levels, which lined up with his age and how fast his body would have been taking it in. He was found lying in a way that looked like he had just fallen asleep. The warning label Renata had taped to the generator was later found on the garage floor next to it, still readable. Months afterward, she brought it to a legislative hearing in an evidence bag and spoke without much emotion showing. The following year, a state law required portable generators sold locally to carry permanent, non-removable carbon monoxide warnings. The bill was informally named after Cody, though Renata asked that his name not be used. She said she did not want it tied to how he died. She sold the house later that year and moved. He understood the warnings, but chose to rely on his own judgment. The next story shifts from a closed garage and a generator mistake to a backyard setup where electricity and water become the danger. Fireworks had been going off across a Clarksburg neighborhood for most of the evening. By the time this group gathered in one backyard, it was already dark and humid, with the sound of other displays carrying from nearby streets. It was July 4th, 2016. About 14 people were there. The children had been sent inside. Terrence Bowl was the one setting off the fireworks. He was 34 and worked the parts counter outside town. He coached his nephew's Little League team and made hot sauce that he gave away to friends and family. In most areas of his life, he followed basic safety habits. But people who knew him later described a pattern. When something had started and others were watching, he tended to take it a step further. The fireworks he was using were not standard consumer items. The mortar rack contained 6 3-inch shells and had been purchased earlier that day from a roadside stand across the state line. The instructions showed the tubes secured upright in the ground and listed a minimum safe distance. He did not set it up that way. Instead, he placed the tubes in a coffee can filled with sand. He had already fired several shells using that setup without a failure. One cleared a nearby tree, another burst lower than expected. He continued. For the final shell, Terry said he would angle it over the tree by resting the tube on his shoulder. He demonstrated the position, tube braced against his shoulder, one hand steadying it, head turned away. He said he had seen something similar online, despite the clear instability of the setup. His friend Kevin Doss began recording and said it was a bad idea. Others laughed. No one intervened, and the moment shifted from warning to performance. Terry loaded the shell, tilted the tube off vertical, and lit the fuse. The fuse burned briefly. I want you to sit with how little time actually passes before everything changes here. The lift charge ignited, but the shell failed to properly clear the tube before the burst charge detonated. This type of malfunction is commonly referred to as a flower pot. In such failures, the tube can rupture and fragment, sending high-energy debris and blast forces in multiple directions, including laterally and downward, depending on how the tube fails. The force was concentrated at close range. The explosion occurred at close range, striking the right side of Terry's head and upper body. He collapsed immediately into the grass, the tube falling with him as the blast and fragmentation took effect. The recording captured a flash at the base of the tube, then his body dropping. The camera shook. The audio recorded the blast, followed by a brief silence and then sustained screaming. Emergency services were called. Responders arrived within minutes. He showed no signs of life on their arrival. The autopsy documented catastrophic cranial trauma from close-range blast and fragmentation forces, with extensive skull disruption and severe brain injury consistent with a mortar tube failure. The right hemisphere of the brain sustained severe destruction. The left hemisphere remained structurally intact, but non-functional due to damage to the brainstem. His heart, lungs, and abdominal organs were unaffected. His blood alcohol level was below the legal driving limit. The injuries were not survivable under any circumstances. Right after it happened, the recording ended up being shared outside the group without anyone meaning for it to. It got passed around quickly before it could be taken down, and copies kept appearing after that. Kevin Doss later said he never watched it again and only remembers the sound, not what was actually in the video. A civil case was filed against the seller of the fireworks and was resolved out of court. The incident was later used in safety materials emphasizing proper mortar placement, often accompanied by diagrams showing the correct vertical positioning of the tube and warnings against handheld use. In the weeks after, Terry's belongings remained largely undisturbed. The batch of hot sauce he had made that summer stayed in mason jars in the garage. One co-worker kept a jar on a shelf in his office for years before eventually throwing it away. From my perspective, that kind of attachment says more about memory than the object itself. He said he couldn't explain why he kept it that long. It comes back to Terry ignoring clear safety rules despite the risks. It likely could have been prevented by using the mortar properly, set upright in the ground, and not trying to handle it. No one in the moment pushed hard enough to stop it before it went ahead. That same misunderstanding of electricity shows up again, but this time it's a backyard pool turning into the problem instead of a fallen power line. It's a backyard pool turning into the problem instead of a fallen power line. Overnight storms moved through Shelby County on April 29, 2015. leaving wet roads and widespread outages across Harpersville. By morning, power was out in roughly 1,800 homes. In one residential area, a distribution line had snapped from a pole 2 houses down and came to rest in a front yard, lying in wet grass not far from a porch. Ronnie Getch, 38, lived in one of those houses. He ran a small house painting business on his own and had spent years working inside people's homes, handling repairs and basic fixes as needed. That familiarity had built up over time into a general sense that he could usually judge problems without waiting for outside input. His daughter Lily, 17, was staying with him that weekend. She had been awake since the storm passed and stayed near the doorway while he moved around the house. At some point, Ronnie stepped outside to check the yard conditions after noticing the fallen line nearby. Across the street, neighbor Paulette Odom, 62, a retired school secretary, had already seen the downed line and called emergency services. While still on the phone, she saw Ronnie step outside carrying a push broom. The line lay roughly 15 feet from his porch. It had not been confirmed as de-energized. Ronnie had not called for help. He assumed the line was safe because his power was out. I think this assumption shows up more often than people expect in downed line incidents like this. Instead of waiting for confirmation, he went outside and approached it directly. A line can be dead at one point in the grid and still energized at another. The utility had not yet isolated the fault. The line was carrying approximately 7,200 volts. He kept walking toward the downed line holding a wooden broom. It had been left outside overnight in the rain, so it was wet. Wood doesn't usually carry electricity, but when it's soaked, it can sometimes let small amounts of current travel across the surface, especially with high-voltage lines. Across the street, Paulette shouted a warning. He did not respond or did not register it. She told the dispatcher a man was approaching the line with an object and stayed on the call. Moments later, he made contact. This is the exact point where everything shifts, and there's no reversal after it. The current passed from the energized line into the wet broom handle and through his body, with entry at the point of contact and multiple internal pathways toward ground contact points. At that voltage, severe electrical injury can rapidly trigger ventricular fibrillation or cardiac arrest. The involuntary muscle contraction was strong enough to cause him to lose balance and fall backward. He landed on his back in the wet grass and did not move. Lily saw him fall and ran from the porch. Paulette remained across the street. She did not approach. The line was still live. She stayed on the call and described what she was seeing as Lily reached her father and began shaking him and calling his name. The dispatcher remained on the line with her for several minutes until responders arrived and the area was secured. Emergency crews treated the line as active until the utility confirmed isolation. The autopsy recorded small, circular burns on both palms and matching exit wounds on the soles of the feet. These marks are consistent with high-voltage electrocution. Internal damage was far more extensive than external injury suggested. The heart showed ventricular fibrillation, a chaotic rhythm caused by electrical disruption. Muscle tissue in both arms and the chest showed hemorrhaging from extreme involuntary contraction. Several ribs were fractured, likely from the force of that contraction rather than the fall. The brain showed no direct injury. Investigators noted that survival would have required immediate defibrillation and CPR within seconds of contact, which was not possible while the line remained energized. The broom handle showed carbonization at the grip and contact point, with moisture still present along its length. Lily was taken to her mother's home that afternoon. In the following weeks, she expressed confusion and guilt, telling her mother she thought she had done something wrong by not helping correctly. Paulette Odom provided a full statement and declined media interviews. She later moved out of the area. The utility company revised its safety messaging that summer. Downed lines are always live until confirmed otherwise. Stay away. Call immediately. Ronnie approached the downed line before it was confirmed safe. The next case moves away from electricity entirely, but the same pattern of ignoring safety instructions shows up with fireworks instead. In yard work, instructions shows up with fireworks instead. In yard work, the danger usually doesn't come from anything dramatic. It comes from normal moments people don't think twice about, leaving a tool running because you'll only be a second, using whatever setup is already there instead of resetting it, or assuming a quick fix doesn't need you to stop and start over. Nothing about it feels urgent in the moment, because everything already seems under control. This is what happened to Marvin Osei on July 19, 2017, in Decatur, Georgia. Temperatures had stayed above 90 degrees since late morning, and Marvin was doing routine yard maintenance in the backyard of his home. Earlier in the afternoon, his wife Patricia had noticed an indoor extension cord stretched from the house across damp grass left from sprinkler use. The cord was not designed for outdoor conditions and ran over wet soil near metal fixtures in the yard. She pointed it out directly and told him it should not be used that way, suggesting it be moved or replaced before continuing. The issue was acknowledged, but the setup remained in place and work continued. Marvin proceeded to use a corded yard tool powered through that same extension cord. The environment included damp soil, residual moisture on the grass, and multiple nearby conductive surfaces such as metal yard fixtures. While nothing about the setup would have appeared unusual in a typical residential setting, it combined electrical equipment intended for dry indoor use with wet outdoor conditions. While he was using it, the tool got stuck and jammed. This can happen when something gets caught in the moving parts, making the motor work harder and the mechanism stop moving the way it should. Standard safety procedure in this situation requires the tool to be turned off and disconnected from power before any attempt is made to clear the obstruction. Instead, Marvin reached toward the mechanism while the tool was still running and still connected to power. The system remained energized, and the internal components had not fully stopped moving. The motor continued to apply force to the jammed area as the obstruction was being addressed. When his hand entered the mechanism, contact with moving components occurred immediately. Because the equipment was still active under load, there was no delay between contact and exposure to mechanical force. The sequence progressed in a fraction of a second, consistent with powered tools where motion continues until power is fully removed. What stands out here is how fast things change once a choice like that is made. There's no time to rethink it or slow it down. It's just a split-second decision. And once the hand goes into a running machine, everything that happens next is already locked in. He collapsed near the equipment, which remained running briefly before being shut off. A neighbor nearby heard a change in the operating sound of the tool and went to check on the situation. Marvin was found unresponsive on the ground beside the equipment. Emergency services were called immediately, and responders arrived shortly after. There were no signs of life upon arrival. The autopsy confirmed severe traumatic injury, consistent with contact with a powered blade mechanism while energized. No underlying medical conditions were identified, and toxicology results were negative. The investigation reviewed both the environment and the sequence of actions leading up to the incident. The extension cord setup was noted as unsafe, but it was not the cause of the fatal injury. The critical factor was that the tool remained powered when he reached into it. The main issue wasn't anything complicated. Marvin reached into a jammed tool while it was still running. Cutting the power first is what prevents contact with moving parts, and that step was skipped. The earlier concern about the extension cord was noted, but the fatal moment came from interacting with an active machine. In situations like this, it's usually the same pattern. The task feels familiar, nothing seems urgent, and when something jams, the instinct is to fix it quickly instead of stopping first. The final story removes tools and equipment completely, but the same decision-making issue appears on a motorcycle at highway speed. The air stayed warm well after sunset in Charlotte, North Carolina. Heavy humidity hanging over a small backyard gathering where friends and neighbors moved casually between the house, patio, and pool. Music playing low in the background. Music playing low in the background. On August 12, 2018, Curtis Pell, 52, was one of the guests. He worked at a parts counter outside town and had known the host and several others for years. He wasn't the center of attention, just someone familiar in the group, moving through conversations, staying near the patio and pool as the night went on, and continuing to drink as things gradually loosened up around him. At some point, though, the tone around him changed. Curtis had already been told not to get in. Earlier in the evening, a neighbor hosting the gathering noticed him near the pool after several drinks and made a direct comment. It wasn't confrontational, just a short warning to stay out of the water for the night. Curtis dismissed it immediately, waving it off and responding that he had been swimming his whole life. The exchange was brief, no one pushed it further. he continued drinking. Roughly an hour later, he returned to the pool area and began taking off his shoes. Another guest, someone who had known him for years, told him plainly not to get in. The concern was clear and specific. Curtis brushed it off the same way as before. He said he was okay, insisted he'd done it plenty of times, and still went into the water anyway. At that point, there was no escalation. The warning had been given twice and dismissed twice. Both people who spoke up allowed it to end there. Curtis appeared steady on his feet, speaking normally, moving without obvious difficulty. Nothing about his behavior suggested immediate danger to anyone watching casually. No one stayed focused on him after that. The pool remained unsupervised. People shifted back into conversations, moved between the yard and the house, and treated the moment as routine. From a distance, it looked like a familiar scene, someone entering the water at a backyard gathering, nothing out of place. But the conditions had already changed. Alcohol impairment doesn't always show itself in a clear way. A person can still seem steady, still talk and move normally, while coordination and reaction time are already starting to slip. In water, those small changes matter more than they seem to on land. Breathing gets harder to control, body position becomes less stable, and even minor disorientation is harder to recover from. Curtis moved toward the deeper section of the pool. Witnesses later stated there was no visible distress at that point. No splashing, no call for help, no sudden movement that would draw attention. From outside the pool, his position appeared consistent with someone floating or resting. That interpretation held. At some point, his movement stopped. The change was subtle enough that it went unrecognized for several minutes. The lack of noise or visible struggle contributed to the delay. People nearby did not identify the situation as an emergency while it was happening. When someone eventually looked more closely, I saw he was face down in the water and unresponsive. I remember that moment feeling unreal, like it took a second for my mind to accept what I was actually seeing. He was pulled from the pool and placed on the deck. Emergency services were called, CPR was started, and he was transported to a hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Autopsy confirmed drowning with alcohol as a contributing factor. No medical conditions or environmental hazards were found. Investigators cited impairment, lack of supervision, and delayed recognition as key factors. Curtis was warned twice not to enter the water, but dismissed both warnings and got in anyway while impaired. He was not actively monitored once in the pool. The sequence followed a clear pattern: warning, dismissal, continued activity under alcohol, and delayed recognition once distress began. By the time he was noticed face down in the water, intervention was no longer effective.